The dense canopy of trees whispered with the cool breeze of the evening, and as the last golden rays of sunlight dipped below the horizon, the forest grew eerily quiet. The night was descending fast, blanketing the world in shadow, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. Easton, a young millionaire with a sharp mind and an even sharper sense of responsibility, was pacing through the woods. His dark hair, now tousled by the wind, and his green eyes piercing yet filled with the weight of an internal storm betrayed the conflict that raged within him. His expensive suit, gleaming under the fading sunlight, seemed out of place in this wild setting. He had come here to clear his mind after a bitter argument with Violet, his wife of just a few months. The fight had been fierce, leaving him angry and restless, unsure of where his life was headed. Suddenly, a faint cry cut through the stillness, a sound so delicate, so foreign in this secluded space, that it sent a chill down his spine. Easton froze. His heart skipped a beat. Who could be bringing a baby out here? He murmured to himself, his thoughts racing with a mixture of concern and disbelief. Driven by an almost primal curiosity, he pushed aside the dense foliage in front of him, moving toward the sound. What he saw next sent a shiver through his body. A young woman, no older than 25, sitting against a gnarled tree trunk. Her clothes were tattered, her hair wild and unkempt. She looked every bit the beggar Easton had encountered in his more charitable moments, but something about her was different. In her arms she cradled a baby wrapped in a ragged, dirty blanket. The woman's eyes, wide with fear, locked onto Easton's with a panic that he could feel in his chest. Before he could say a word, the baby whimpered, the tiny sound breaking the tension in the air. Easton stepped closer, his voice low and soothing. "Calm down. I'm not here to hurt you. It's okay. Do you need help? I can take you to safety or call someone. Whatever you need." The woman didn't respond immediately. Her gaze flickered nervously between Easton and the baby, as if weighing whether to trust him or flee. And then, in that quiet moment, Easton saw it, the birthmark. A crescent-shaped mark, identical to the one he had on his own left cheek. It was unmistakable. He took a step forward, his breath catching in his throat. "No, it can't be," he whispered to himself, his voice trembling with disbelief. "That mark. It's just like mine." The beggar woman, visibly startled by his reaction, began to retreat, her body trembling. She seemed to lose her footing and stumbled, her arms releasing their hold on the baby. In an instant, the infant flew through the air, its tiny body spiraling toward the ground. Easton's heart raced as time seemed to slow. Without thinking, he lunged forward, arms stretched wide, and managed to catch the baby just before it hit the hard, rocky earth. He rolled to protect the child, cradling the infant to his chest. The world around them spun as he lay there, panting, his heart hammering. The baby, now crying loudly, seemed unharmed but terrified. Easton looked down at the little one, checking for injuries, his hands trembling with relief as he found no visible harm. The baby's cries echoed in the forest, a sound that brought a mix of joy and anxiety into his chest. He sat up slowly, gently holding the baby in his arms. His eyes shifted to the woman, who was now lying on the ground, her expression blank, as if the weight of what had just happened had knocked the wind out of her. Easton's voice broke through the silence, shaky but determined. "It's okay. The baby's safe. But you have to tell me what's going on. Why does this child look so much like me? Where did you come from?" The woman's gaze locked with his, and for a long moment it seemed as if she were deciding whether to speak or remain silent. Her eyes, wide with fear, never left his face, as if she could read the storm inside him. Finally, with a trembling voice, she spoke. I can't say. He's not mine, but I was forced to do this. Please don't take me to the police. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I didn't have a choice." Easton's mind raced. The words she spoke didn't make sense, yet the desperation in her voice was palpable. He looked down at the baby again, feeling an unexplainable pull, as though this tiny soul was tied to his in some mysterious way. A wave of conflicting emotions crashed over him: confusion, anger, and an overwhelming sense of connection to the child in his arms. Before he could speak again, the woman's eyes darted nervously around the darkening forest, her body tensing as if preparing to flee. "Please don't make me go back," she pleaded, her voice barely above a whisper. "You don't understand. If they find me here, it will be worse. They'll take him away from me. I can't." Easton reached out instinctively. "Wait, please, just calm down. I won't hurt you. I want to help." His voice softened, but there was urgency beneath it. He didn't know what she was running from, but something told him he couldn't let her go, not yet. But the woman, wild-eyed and frantic, wasn't listening. Without another word, she turned and bolted into the trees, her feet stumbling over the twisted roots that seemed to rise out of the ground to trip her. The baby, still in Easton's arms, cried louder, sensing the woman's fear. "Stop!" Easton shouted, his voice cracking as he followed her. "It's dangerous to run like this, especially with the baby." The forest, dense and dark, seemed to close in around them. The ground was uneven, the shadows growing deeper by the second. Easton's heart raced as he chased after the woman, but before he could reach her, disaster struck. She tripped, her foot catching on a root, and she fell forward, the baby slipping from her grasp. Time seemed to freeze as the tiny figure tumbled through the air, its cries piercing the night. Easton lunged once more, arms outstretched in a desperate attempt to catch the child before it hit the ground. But he was too late. The baby struck the earth with a soft, sickening thud, lying motionless for a breathless moment. Easton's world turned to chaos as he scrambled to the infant's side. "No, please," he whispered, his voice trembling with fear and guilt. For a heart-stopping moment, the baby didn't make a sound. Then, finally, a faint cry escaped its lips. Relief washed over Easton like a wave. He gently scooped the baby into his arms again, feeling its tiny body shudder in fear but still breathing. But the woman, her strength spent, had collapsed on the ground, unconscious. Easton's mind raced as he weighed the urgency of the situation. He needed help, and he needed it now. With trembling hands, he dialed emergency services, his voice ragged with adrenaline. "Please, I need an ambulance. There's a baby injured in the woods near Oak Road and a woman who's unconscious. Please hurry." As he continued to comfort the baby, the minutes felt like hours. Finally, the sound of sirens pierced the night, signaling the arrival of help. Paramedics rushed to the scene, taking the baby from Easton's arms with professional precision while another attended to the beggar woman. Easton, still in shock, watched helplessly as they loaded both the baby and the woman into the ambulance. The paramedics turned to him, asking if he would accompany them. "Yes," Easton said without hesitation. "I'll go. I need to know they're okay." As the ambulance doors slammed shut and the vehicle sped off into the night, Easton's mind was filled with one question: what in the world was going on? Easton's heart was still racing as he sat in the sterile white ambulance, the sound of beeping monitors filling the air like an ominous warning. The baby lay in front of him, pale and fragile, connected to a maze of wires and tubes. His small body seemed so vulnerable, and yet there was something about him, a connection, a deep sense of familiarity that Easton couldn't shake. He wasn't sure why, but his thoughts kept circling back to the beggar woman, who had collapsed just moments before, her frail form slumped in the corner of the vehicle. She had said something that felt so important, yet it didn't make sense. "Will you be coming with us?" one of the EMTs asked, breaking Easton's dazed thoughts. Easton nodded automatically, his gaze still fixed on the baby, barely noticing the woman stirring beside him. Her eyes fluttered open slowly, as though struggling against the fog of unconsciousness. She blinked in confusion before her gaze finally landed on Easton, and he froze, his breath catching in his throat. "Easton." Easton, she murmured weakly, her voice fragile, barely audible above the hum of the ambulance. The words hit him like a jolt of electricity. "How? How do you know my name?" he whispered, barely able to comprehend her words. "I need to talk to you," she continued, her voice trembling. "I'm not feeling well, but there's something I need to tell you, something important." Easton leaned closer, his heart hammering. "What is it? What do you need to tell me?" His voice quivered with both concern and confusion, his mind racing as he tried to piece together the pieces of this strange puzzle. But before she could respond, her words faltered and her face twisted with pain. She tried to sit up, but the paramedics gently pushed her back down. Still, her eyes remained locked onto his with an intensity that sent a shiver down his spine. "The baby. As she began, her voice barely above a whisper, but then the monitors began to beep frantically, and her words dissolved into a scream of pain. Easton's stomach dropped as he saw the beggar woman's face drain of color, her body trembling violently as her eyes rolled back in her head. "She's going into shock," one of the paramedics shouted, pushing Easton aside as they rushed into action, working quickly to stabilize her. The rest of the ride to the hospital was a blur. Sirens wailed, voices shouted orders, and the monitors continued their rhythmic beeping. Easton sat, feeling completely helpless, his mind racing with the strange events of the night. Who was this woman? And what did she mean about the baby? How did she know his name? His head throbbed with confusion as he stared at the baby, who lay in a state of fragile stillness, hooked up to life-saving equipment. When the ambulance finally screeched to a halt in front of the hospital, Easton barely noticed the flurry of activity around him. He was ushered into the waiting room by a nurse, who assured him that they would do everything they could to save both the woman and the child. But her words didn't provide much comfort. He could barely sit still, pacing back and forth, his mind consumed with the woman's cryptic words. The hours dragged on. The waiting room felt suffocating, the air thick with tension. Easton's thoughts kept returning to the baby, his resemblance to Easton himself as a child, the birthmark on his cheek, and the woman's words, "The baby. He is." What did she mean by that? And why did he feel so inexplicably drawn to the little boy? Suddenly, a flurry of movement in the hallway caught his attention. Nurses rushed by, their faces etched with worry. He caught snippets of their conversation, critical desaturation pressure dropping, "We need to act fast." Panic surged through him as he stood up, his legs unsteady beneath him. "What's happening?" he demanded, but before he could take a step toward them, a security guard stepped in his path. "Please, sir, let the doctors work," the man said, his voice calm but firm. Easton wanted to argue, to push past the man and demand answers, but he felt his strength falter. He had no choice but to step back, leaning against the wall as his heart pounded in his chest. "Please, God," he whispered, tears springing to his eyes. "Don't let that baby die." Time seemed to stretch and twist in the unbearable silence. Every second felt like an eternity as Easton waited, his mind swirling with fear and uncertainty. And then, just as his hope began to fade, a doctor appeared, his expression weary but relieved. "The baby's stable," the doctor said, his voice a balm to Easton's frayed nerves. "It was a close call, but he's a fighter. We had to resuscitate him, but he responded well." The doctor paused, glancing away for a moment. "As for the woman, she's in a coma. We can't predict when or if she'll wake up." Easton absorbed the information numbly, his body sagging with a mixture of relief and concern. "Can I see the baby?" he asked, his voice breaking as the weight of his emotions settled in. "Please, let me see him." The doctor nodded, and Easton was led to the neonatal intensive care unit. The baby lay in a tiny bassinet, surrounded by tubes and monitors. The rhythmic beep of the heart monitor was the only sound in the room, but it was a sound that brought Easton some comfort, a reminder that the little fighter was still alive. It was then that Easton noticed something, a small, simple identification bracelet on the baby's wrist. As he leaned in closer to read it, his breath caught in his throat. The name written on it was Owen. Owen, Easton whispered, his heart racing. The name that he and Nora had chosen years ago, before their relationship ended, before everything had changed. The name was a cruel twist of fate, and it sent a flood of memories crashing into him. His mind reeled with the implications. How was this possible? The baby stirred slightly, his tiny hand reaching out as though seeking comfort. Easton gently touched it, his fingers trembling. "Who are you, Owen?" he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "And how are you going to change my life?" As he stood there watching the baby sleep, his mind buzzed with questions. The beggar woman's words, the resemblance to his younger self, the birthmark, everything pointed to a truth that Easton was afraid to accept, yet couldn't deny. The answers might never come, but for now the only thing he could do was keep vigil over the little boy who had unknowingly become a part of his life. The next morning, Easton drove home, Owen safely strapped into the car seat beside him. The golden light of the sunrise bathed the road ahead, but his mind was clouded with the uncertainty of what lay ahead. How would he explain everything to Violet? The doctor's words echoed in his mind. The baby is ready to go home, but he will need special care. Easton glanced at the peaceful little face of Owen and whispered softly, "Don't worry, little one. I'll take care of you, no matter what." But as he arrived at his mansion and stepped out of the car, he felt a knot of anxiety tighten in his chest. Violet was waiting for him, her eyes red and swollen from hours of crying. "Where have you been?" she demanded, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger and fear. "Why did you disappear all night? I was imagining the worst." And now you show up. With her voice trailed off when her gaze fell on Owen, and her expression shifted instantly from anger to disbelief. The questions began, the accusations, the disbelief. Violet was no longer the woman he had married. But Easton couldn't afford to explain it all in that moment. All he could do was hold Owen in his arms and hope, pray that somehow everything would work out. "I couldn't leave him there." The words struck like a match in Violet, igniting a storm of emotions she could no longer contain. Her eyes burned with fury as she stormed toward him, the mansion's expansive walls reverberating with her voice. "A baby in the woods, Easton? You just bring him into our home without a second thought? What about us? What about our plans? Our family?" Her voice cracked, rising with each word, filling every corner of the room. "You didn't think about me for a second." Easton's chest tightened, his heart pounding as months of frustrations and unspoken resentments erupted like a dam breaking. "Didn't think about you? What about your late nights, Violet? What about those nights you came home smelling like someone else's perfume?" The words tumbled out before he could stop them. "You think I didn't notice? The looks, the messages you tried so hard to hide? Maybe this baby is our chance to do something right, something pure amidst all the mistrust." The slap came faster than he could react. Violet's hand stung his cheek, leaving a red mark as her fury turned into action. "How dare you?" she hissed, tears streaming down her face. "I never cheated on you, never." Her voice shook, the bitterness rising. "Those nights I was planning a surprise, a trip for us, to try for a child of our own," she laughed, the sound bitter and hollow. "How ironic, isn't it? While I dreamt of our future, you bring a stranger's baby into our home." Easton was speechless, the anger fading, replaced by guilt and confusion, but before he could respond, a soft, wailing cry cut through the tense silence. Owen, the baby, their baby now, but his cries only seemed to escalate the tension. Easton's instinct kicked in, and he moved toward the baby, but Violet blocked him, her eyes filled with disdain. "Don't you dare touch him," she warned, her voice quivering. "That baby doesn't belong here. He's not ours." Easton's heart ached at the venom in her words. "He's innocent in all of this, Violet," he pleaded. "He's not at fault. We can't blame him for the circumstances." Before Violet could respond, hurried footsteps echoed down the hallway. The housekeeper, Mrs. Forbes, a woman who'd worked for them for years, appeared at the door, her face pale with worry. "Sir, the police are here," she said, her voice trembling. Easton's stomach dropped. Violet's face drained of color, and they both turned toward the front door. Through the glass windows, they saw the flashing lights of police cruisers. Easton's mind raced. Had someone seen him in the woods? Had the baby's sudden appearance triggered suspicion? Or was there something more, something he didn't know yet? As the doorbell rang, the baby's cries grew louder, almost as if he, too, could sense the tension in the air. Easton glanced at Violet, then at the baby, and finally at the door. He knew that opening it would change everything. The weight of the moment pressed down on him, but there was no turning back now. With one final breath, he opened the door, his hands shaking. 2 officers stood there, their faces grim. The taller one spoke first. "Mr. Easton Clark, we need you to come with us. There are questions about a baby you brought from the hospital. Please come with us." His voice was firm, and Easton couldn't deny the dread creeping in. Easton nodded, feeling Violet's glare burning into his back. The consequences of his actions had arrived faster than he could have imagined. "May I know what I'm being accused of?" Easton asked, trying to steady his voice. The shorter officer's eyes were cold. "For now, there are no formal charges, sir. But there are suspicions of kidnapping." The ride to the police station was filled with an oppressive silence, broken only by Violet's occasional muttered comments, her anger barely contained. Easton tried to explain the situation to the officers, but they advised him to wait until the official statement was given. His mind was a whirlwind of doubts. Had he done the right thing? Or had he just ruined his life for a baby who wasn't even his? At the station, Easton was led into an interrogation room, the sterile atmosphere making his skin crawl. The detective who greeted him was tired, his eyes sharp despite the exhaustion. "Mr. Clark, we're investigating the disappearance of a baby from Central Hospital a week ago." "The baby you brought home matches the description," the detective said, his voice heavy. Easton felt his blood run cold. "But I found him in the woods last night. He was with a beggar woman. I took her to the hospital," he protested, his voice shaky. The detective raised an eyebrow, clearly unconvinced. "A convenient story, wouldn't you say? Especially considering your connection to the child's mother." Before Easton could respond, the door to the room burst open. A woman stormed in, her face a mixture of rage and relief. Easton's heart stopped. It was Nora, his ex-girlfriend. "Where's my son?" she demanded, her voice shrill. "What did you do to him? Why did you let that woman take him from me?" Easton felt as if the floor had been ripped out from under him. He had barely met the baby, yet here she was, accusing him. His mind reeled, and suddenly everything fell into place. The baby in the woods, the name Owen, the birthmark, all of it connected in a way he hadn't understood until now. Violet, who had been watching silently, stepped forward, her face twisted with disbelief. "Your son," she spat. "What are you talking about?" Nora's eyes locked with Violet's. "This man," she said, pointing at Easton, "is the father of my son. The same man who had a beggar woman kidnap him." Easton jumped to his feet, but an officer held him back. "I didn't know. I swear, I didn't know," he pleaded, desperate. The detective's voice cut through the chaos. "Ladies, please calm down. Mr. Clark, I need you to tell us exactly what happened last night." As Easton recounted the events, the tension in the room shifted. Nora and Violet, once full of rage, began to look at him with a reluctant understanding. But the weight of the situation wasn't over. The detective looked thoughtful but stern. "We have a witness from the hospital who confirms part of your story," he said. "The beggar woman was identified as a fugitive psychiatric patient." Nora's face crumpled as she broke down into sobs. Violet, still angry but shaken, retreated to a corner, her eyes fixed on Easton with a mixture of doubt and sorrow. The detective stood, his face grave. For now, Mr. Clark, you're free to go. But don't leave the city. We'll need further statements. I got pregnant right after we broke up and you were with her. She pointed at Violet, who was standing there looking confused and angry. Easton stepped closer to Nora, his hands shaking. I have a right to know, you can't do that, he said, his voice cracking with anger. Before Easton could finish, the phone on the detective's desk rang loudly, cutting through the tension in the room. The detective quickly answered, his expression changing from surprise to concern as he heard the other end. He hung up, turning back to the group standing there. The woman who kidnapped the baby, her name is Lydia. She woke up and escaped from the hospital. This information fell like a bucket of cold water on everyone. Nora screamed in despair, Violet turned pale, Easton felt his legs go weak. This can't be happening. Isn't there a police guard at the hospital? How could she escape? Easton asked, his voice filled with surprise. The detective shook his head, looking at them in confusion. We still don't know how she escaped, but I will mobilize all forces to find her. As these words rang out, something seemed to change in Nora. She stood up, wiping away the tears with her hands, but her eyes were filled with determination. I have to see my child now. If she tries to kidnap my child again, I will not be lenient. I have to leave now. Nora's voice did not allow any objections. Easton nodded slowly, seeing Violet's angry eyes. My child is at my house. He is safe, he said softly. Nora looked at him for a moment and then nodded. Then let's go. I want to take Owen home, where he belongs. These words were like a punch to Easton's stomach. He wanted to protest, to say that he had the right too, but now was not the time to fight. Okay, let's go, he agreed, albeit reluctantly. The journey back to the Easton mansion was a tense silence. Violet didn't want to share the car, so she took a private taxi. When they arrived, Nora rushed inside, led by the maid to Owen's room. Easton followed her, his heart torn between the joy of seeing his son again and the pain of knowing that he might lose him again. Nora hugged Owen, tears streaming down her face. I'm here, baby, forgive me, I took you while you were still in a drugged coma. I'll never let anyone take you away from me again, she whispered, kissing his forehead. Easton stood watching, feeling like an intruder in his own home. Nora, I know I don't have the right to ask, but can I see him sometimes, he asked softly. Nora looked at Easton, her eyes softening a little. You're his father, Easton, of course you can see him, but I need you to promise me one thing. Easton nodded, his heart heavy. I promise, Nora. I never intended to take him away from you. I just want the right to be a part of his life. I'll take care of everything he needs, and I want to be there. Nora looked at him and then at the door. I'll call you tomorrow. You can come see him. Easton watched Nora as she carried Owen into the taxi and the car drove away. He stood at the door, watching the car disappear, his heart torn apart as his son was once again taken away from him. When he turned back, Violet was standing in the hallway, her eyes filled with anger. You must be happy, right? You ruined our marriage for a child you never even knew about, she said coldly, and walked up the stairs, leaving Easton with his thoughts in disarray. The night fell, and the mansion fell into an eerie silence. Easton could not sleep, his mind reeling from the events of the day. Violet had locked herself in the living room, refusing to talk to him. Around midnight, as he leaned against the railing, looking out into the garden, a strange figure appeared in the darkness, startling him. He walked down, his feet following the footsteps, and then he saw her, Lydia, the woman from the woods the day before. You're the one who kidnapped my child. What are you doing here? Easton shouted, his voice tense, mixed with anger. Lydia looked at him, her eyes panicked. I need to see you. Don't call the police, I just want to explain, she said, her voice cracking with fear. Easton was surprised, his anger softening, but he was not forgiving. Explain what? Why did you kidnap my child? Why did you take the child away from its mother? Lydia stepped back, her eyes fearful. That's not it. I don't want to hurt anyone. I escaped from the mental hospital weeks ago. I just wanted to get away from there, she said hastily, as if time was running out for her to finish. Before Easton could reply, a shout came from up ahead. Easton, what's going on? Violet stepped down from the porch, saw Lydia, her eyes wide with panic. She pulled out her phone and called the police immediately. Lydia turned and ran away in a panic. Easton rushed forward, but he was too late. He grabbed her hand, but Lydia pulled it away forcefully, then disappeared into the darkness of the garden. The siren of the police car faded away. Easton stood there, looking at Violet with a confused look, not knowing how to explain. The truth now seemed more confusing than ever. The next day, the sky was gray and cold, as if reflecting Easton's mood. He sat in the car, staring at the teddy bear on the passenger seat, the gift he had prepared for Owen. It's time, he whispered. I'm going to see him for the first time. Easton hesitated as he gathered his courage to step out of the car. The weight of the moment pressed heavily on his chest, and though Violet's prying eyes followed his every move, he barely acknowledged her presence. His focus was elsewhere, drawn to the familiar house that stood before him. Nora's front door loomed like a threshold into the unknown. His heart raced in anticipation, the pounding beat of his pulse almost deafening in the quiet of the evening. He had to see Owen. He needed to. Before he could even reach for the doorbell, it swung open. Nora stood there, holding Owen in her arms, her face a mixture of caution and resignation. I thought you weren't coming, she said simply, stepping aside to let him in. The words, though spoken softly, hit Easton like a thunderclap. He swallowed hard, forcing back the emotions that surged within him. I needed to see him, he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. His gaze flickered to the small child in Nora's arms. Owen, his son. His heart ached as he took in the sight, realizing the vast distance between the life he had imagined and the reality of what had come to pass. As they moved into the living room, Easton took in the familiar sight of a child's play mat, toys scattered haphazardly around it. The remnants of a family's presence lingered in the air, thick with the tension of unresolved histories. Nora carefully placed Owen on the mat and turned back to him. You have an hour. After that I need to put him down for his nap, she said, her tone firm yet not unkind. Easton nodded, grateful for the time, for the moment, even though he knew it was fleeting. He kneeled beside Owen, marveling at the way the baby's little fingers grasped at the air, at the sounds he made, so pure and innocent. I know we've met before, Easton murmured, his voice thick with emotion. But I haven't introduced myself properly. He gazed down at Owen, his words catching in his throat. I'm the father of your child, he whispered, as though the weight of that statement could be too much to bear. Outside, Violet stood hidden in the shadows, watching through the window. Her face, usually so composed, was now twisted with rage, every muscle in her body taut with fury. She saw Easton lift Owen into his arms, and her stomach churned with jealousy as she watched the connection between father and son unfold before her eyes. Her fingers curled around the edge of her phone, shaking with suppressed anger as she dialed a number she knew by heart. The plan has failed, she hissed into the receiver. We need a new arrangement. I want everything to end exactly as we agreed. If there are any mistakes, her voice trailed off into a cold, dangerous silence. Inside the house, Easton remained oblivious to the storm brewing outside. He was lost in the small joys of playing with Owen, making silly faces, cooing and laughing as the baby responded. Every little moment of connection felt like a treasure, something he'd lost so long ago and was now trying to reclaim. Nora watched quietly from a distance, her eyes softening as she observed the bond forming between the two. He has your smile, she commented, her voice gentle but full of meaning. Easton looked up, surprised, and smiled faintly in return. And he has your eyes, he replied, the words tinged with regret. He hadn't been there for so long, had missed so much, but seeing Owen now made him realize what had been stolen from him. The hours seemed to pass in the blink of an eye. Nora announced that it was time for Owen's nap, and Easton felt a pang of loss, as if he were being pulled away from something precious. Reluctantly, he handed Owen back to her, their fingers brushing in the exchange, a fleeting moment of silent understanding. "Can I come back tomorrow?" Easton asked, his voice barely concealing the hope that filled him. "I need to see him. You don't know how happy I am that he's all right, that he's my son." Nora hesitated only a moment before nodding. "Yes," same time she replied, a small smile tugging at her lips. It was a smile that spoke of possibilities of healing. As Easton left Nora's house, a strange mixture of joy and sorrow filled his chest. He had spent the last hour with his son, his real son, and it had felt like a dream, one he didn't want to wake from. But as he approached his car, he saw Violet standing there, her posture stiff and her expression cold. The joy drained from him in an instant. "What are you doing here?" Easton asked, his voice tight with tension. But Violet didn't even give him the chance to explain. With a flick of her wrist, she silenced him. "Don't even try to explain, Easton. You've made your choice. Now deal with the consequences." She hissed, her words cutting through him like a blade. Without another word, Violet turned and walked away, leaving Easton standing there, feeling the weight of his decisions pressing down on him. The days that followed were filled with a cold, heavy silence. Easton spent his time working and visiting Owen, but the distance between him and Violet seemed to grow with each passing day. It wasn't until one afternoon, when Easton came downstairs ready to leave for the office, that he found Violet in the living room, a forced smile on her lips. "Easton, dear, I've been thinking," she began, her voice unusually sweet, though Easton could see the tension in her shoulders. "Perhaps I reacted poorly to all of this." With Owen, her words threw him off guard. He studied her carefully, wondering what this sudden shift in tone meant. "I mean," Violet continued, her smile widening, "maybe it's time to accept reality. Owen is your son now, and he's part of our lives. I was thinking," she hesitated, drawing in a breath, "what if I took care of him today? You could bring him here, and I'll stay with him while you work." Easton's mind raced, unsure of how to process the offer. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice full of hesitation and a glimmer of hope. Violet nodded, her smile now seeming more genuine. "I'm sure, Easton. It's time we made this work." As a family, the words hung in the air, laden with meaning. Easton, caught between skepticism and relief, managed a small smile. "Thank you, Violet," he said, his voice thick with gratitude. He leaned in to kiss her on the cheek, the touch soft and brief. Hours later, Easton left the house, his heart lighter than it had been in days. Violet stood by the door, holding Owen, and he couldn't help but feel a small flicker of hope. But little did he know, as soon as he drove away, that Violet's smile would fade. She stared at the baby in her arms, her eyes narrowing with growing malice. "So it's just you and me now, little intruder," she whispered, her voice laced with venom. The smile on her face was gone, replaced by something darker. "You have no idea the chaos you've caused, do you?" She looked at Owen, her gaze cold and calculating. "But don't worry, you won't be here for long." In the dim light of the office lamp, Easton felt as if he had been kicked in the stomach. His legs almost buckled at Lydia's words. "You have to listen to me. Owen is in danger," she said, her voice hoarse and desperate. Easton stared, unable to comprehend. What are you talking about? Where is Owen?" He grabbed Lydia's shoulders, his face only inches from hers. His eyes searched her frightened features for some sign of truth. Lydia gripped his hand, her eyes filling with tears. "Violet and I have known each other since college. She knew about Nora's pregnancy before you did," she began, her words coming out like a wolf being beaten with a dike. "Violet had planned it all for months. She knew I was locked up in a mental hospital, and that if I was found out, I would be discredited. She wanted me to steal the baby after it was born and give it to her in exchange for my freedom. Easton felt the ground sink beneath him. It can't be. It can't be, he muttered, his voice rough, as if it were the physical pain that was pounding into his heart. Lydia continued, tears falling. I couldn't do it. When I went to the woods with Owen, I couldn't give him up. That's when you found me. I'm mentally ill, but I'm not a bad person. I couldn't hurt an innocent child, even if leaving that place was what I wanted. She breathed in, feeling the tears. But now, Violet called me this afternoon. She said she had a baby and was going to give it to a foster family who were willing to send it overseas. Easton, she's going to do it. You have to end her before it's too late. Easton's heart kept repeating. The truth was breaking in his head. Violet's storm of betrayal, the danger that was moving towards Owen, all like a strong rolling wave, drowning him in hysteria and violence. He stood up, went out at night, ate his innate breakfast. Owen, my son. This can't be happening. He rushed out, his hands shaking as he called the police, his voice urgent and fearful, warning, I need to report a kidnapping. My son. My wife, his words were almost incoherent, but in his mind there was only one thing to do: save Owen. When Easton called Nora, she answered immediately, her voice sleepy as if she had just woken up. Easton, what's wrong? He couldn't keep his composure. Owen's in trouble, Violet. His words came back, muddled by the storm. Nora took a deep breath, her voice shaking. Easton, please tell me. Is Owen okay? Can you tell me more? Nora, Easton interrupted, you meet me right away. I'll explain on the way. But we have to go fast, there's no time. Save our child, he hung up without waiting for an answer, then turned to Lydia, who was still standing there, shaking. You come with me, you'll have to tell all the police. Lydia nodded, saying nothing more, just quietly following Easton as he breathlessly left the office, running down the elevator to the parking lot. All the way there, Lydia's sense of despair echoed in the air. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to hurt anyone. I just wanted to get away from that horrible place, she whispered, her voice full of remorse. Easton barely heard her, his mind focused on one thing: getting there and finding Owen. As the car sped through the dark streets, the roar of the car echoing in the distance, he couldn't shake the terrifying thought from his mind: am I going to respond? Is Owen taken away? When the car stopped in front of the mansion, Nora was waiting, her face pale with worry, especially when she saw Lydia with Easton. Without waiting for an explanation, Easton took out his phone and dialed Violet's number. When Violet answered, he took a deep breath, trying to calm himself. His voice strained. Violet, you're right, the girls will get in our way. I can't be a father right now. I think I have to adopt this girl without Nora knowing. Silence on the other end of the line, then Violet at the store. Oh, Easton, I know you'll understand. I'm downtown, we'll work things out and then we'll be happy. Easton didn't say another word, just hung up and gave Nora a determined look. Get in the car, we're going to save our child. The drive to the adoption center was a race against time. Easton drove like his life depended on it, while Nora clutched the steering wheel and Lydia zoomed in the back seat. The roar of the police cars was closer than ever, like a promise of justice approaching. When they got there, Easton didn't wait for the car to stop. He jumped out of the car and rushed inside with Nora right behind him, their hearts beating in unison. There was only one thing on their minds: Owen. When they rushed in, they were met by Violet, who was holding Owen in her arms. Her violet eyes widened in surprise, then anger as she realized she had fallen into a trap. You tricked me, she cried, Owen firmly in her arms. Easton took another step forward, his hand outstretched, his voice firm. Violet, it's over. Give me Owen. Don't make it worse. The confrontation became tense and emotional. Violet threatened and begged, while Easton and Nora tried to get closer, fearing for Owen's safety. Finally, Nora couldn't hold on any longer. She stepped forward, her voice choked. Violet, please. The baby is ours." Just then, the sound of police sirens grew closer, the sound of hurried, anxious footsteps echoing down the hallway. Violet realized she was trapped, frantically searching for a way out. Her eyes stopped at a nearby window. For a moment she seemed about to do something extreme. But Easton took another step, his voice softening. "Violet, just give me Owen. Everything will be fine." Time seemed to stop. Violet suddenly collapsed to the ground, her hands falling limp. Nora rushed over, holding Owen in her arms. At the same time, the police burst in, guns in hand, ready to act. Violet was arrested and Lydia was handcuffed and led away. As the two women were taken away, Easton turned to Nora, looking into her eyes, feeling peace return for a moment. Owen, who had no idea of the drama that had just occurred, smiled at his mother and father. Easton hugged Nora and Owen, his eyes brimming with tears of joy. "We did it," he whispered. Nora smiled, squeezing his hand. "Yes, and now we have a beautiful future.